Well, I think, you've also got this issue of the Prime Minister putting his cock in a dead pig's mouth. How is that going to...
Dan. Prolonged period of weak growth, higher borrowing and another 6 years of cuts. More pain, lasting longer than the public was promised by the coalition.
London on fire, a wave of violence and looting raging across the city.
And I will now form a majority Conservative government.
But you can't expect to win if your arguments are ludicrous. And you know this one is ludicrous.
Hasta la vista, baby!
Overnight, the pound lost nearly 5% of its value.
Economic credibility, gone. They're all gone. So why is she still here?
I am a fighter and not a quitter. Cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party.
I've started to get this feeling that I'm totally fucked. You know, everything's fucked. Everything's just completely fucked.
You have been feeling this for a while.
Britain, a land famous for its history, art, culture, innovation, and that time they took over more or less the entire world. Sadly, our once great nation has been brought to its knees by a decade and a half of austerity, corruption, economic calamities, and a government so scandalous that, like if Bill Clinton was having an affair with Richard Nixon inside the Watergate Hotel.
This used to be a green and pleasant land. Now it's the colour of the fucking BBC weather map.
Here's some stats for you, just to get across what 14 years of Conservative government does to a country. Child poverty in the UK is over 30%. Under the Tories, hospital waiting lists have tripled. Our rail network is both simultaneously one of the most expensive and worst networks in Europe. 2/3 of our prisons are overcrowded, and it's so bad that in some of the bigger cities, they're not even proper prisons anymore. It's like Arkham City over there, with inmates just being left to it. And because the prisons are so overcrowded, there's a huge backlog in the justice system, to the point where if you commit a crime, even a serious one, you'll probably get away with it. For example, there were 70,000 rapes reported in the UK between September 2022 and 2023, and of those 70,000 cases, just barely over 1,000 resulted in a criminal charge. And by the way, based off of growth projections from before the Conservatives took power, we should all be over 10 grand richer. Oh, and this isn't mentioning how our schools and hospitals are literally falling apart, the political system is fundamentally broken on multiple levels, how the way we mishandled Brexit massively damaged our international reputation, and how we're currently dumping record levels of shit into the water, while water company bosses are getting record bonuses. We're dumping record levels of shit into the water, and we're fucking paying the people doing it. Jesus Christ. Things had actually gotten so bad in the country that I decided to leave and live in Europe for a bit. Then this twat decided to do this.
Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
So I'm back here. Again. You know, I really feel like after suffering through 14 fucking years of Conservative bullshit, I've just got a vent, to be honest.
And as Big Ben strikes 10.
Fucking BBC. The UK is a country made up of 4 other countries called England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. These countries are sort of countries. They each have their own parliaments, governments and their own laws separate from the UK government, apart from England, which is the UK government. England doesn't need its own government or any of that crap, because England is already by far the most powerful country in the Union. Just look at the population difference between us. Almost makes you wonder why we are part of the same country. Most English people don't think about any of this, to the point where I reckon if you ask your average Englishman what the Welsh Parliament was called, they'd probably respond with, Wales has its own parliament? Of the devolved governments, Scotland has the most power to give the UK the finger, Wales is more or less still England's bitch, and Northern Ireland is usually too chaotic to even get the doors open. These governments always tend to be left-wing, which means that they have often clashed with the UK government, which is usually made up of Tories. And because of the power imbalance between England and the other countries, it means the whole thing is screwed. Think of it like if America was only 4 states, and those states were Colorado, Connecticut and Rhode Island, and California, but also California is the federal government at the same time. We'll get into all the chaos this setup causes later, but for now, let's take a closer look at Westminster itself. Westminster, or the UK Parliament, is broken. There are two chambers in Parliament. The first is the House of Commons, which is the famous one. It's the one where the party leaders drop their little diss tracks on each other every couple of days. The House of Commons is made up of 650 members of Parliament, or MPs, though actually it's usually a little less than that because not all the Northern Irish ones turn up for there are reasons. Each MP is voted in via a general election, which is actually a series of local elections that happen to be held everywhere at the same time. Right across the country, there are 650 elections being held in various areas of vaguely equal population, and yeah, there is a lot of gerrymandering most of the time. In the UK, we use a voting system called first past the post, which means you get one vote for whichever local candidate you like, and that's it. If we were in a two-party system, that would work, but we're not. We're in a sort of two-party system, because of course we are. Here's first past the post with only two candidates running. As you can see, most people voted for the red party, so the red party wins the seat. But if we add in orange, whose voters are actually pretty similar to the red ones, now the red vote has been split and blue comes out as the MP, even though most voters would have preferred red if given the choice just between these two. This is oversimplified, so let's look at somewhere actually real. In 2019, Bury North voted Conservative with just 46% of the vote, meaning most voters didn't actually want the Conservative candidate. In fact, almost exactly the same amount of people voted for the Labour candidate, but because there can only be one MP for the entire area, everyone gets represented by the lizard. We'll take the most marginal seat of all, Fermanagh and South Tyrone, where the Sinn Féin candidate won by just 57 votes. 57 fucking votes! Sadly, it isn't uncommon for MPs to get into Parliament with less than 40, sometimes even 30% of the vote. Because the vote gets split so much, and because there can only be one MP for one constituency, it means that almost all of the time, in every seat up and down the country, we get an MP in which most constituents didn't actually vote for. Fun fact for you, most Brits vote left wing consistently. The Tories usually only get around 35 to 40% of the vote, and Labour are usually about the same, but because the left wing vote then gets split so much, it means we end up with getting Tories all the time. There are a lot of left wing parties in the UK, too many to be honest, which often just end up splitting the left wing vote and giving us Tory governments. Whereas on the right, there's mainly just the Conservatives. A tiny, massive little fucking asterisk there. Look, the headline is basically the way our voting system works in the UK is broken. It's just broken, and it means that despite the fact that Britain is actually a left-wing country, we end up constantly voting in Conservatives who none of us actually like, and then occasionally we get a Labour government that is still... I mean, they're a bit better, but they're basically still cancer. My suggestion, make national elections actually national and leave the MP stuff to strengthen local governments. But I'm just a guy, what do I know? Anyway, the House of Commons is a rat's nest. As for the House of Lords, to be fair, it looks as though the House of Lords isn't going to be a thing for much longer, so it's nice to see that we're finally joining the 20th century, although this is coming from a man who breaks promises harder than Glaswegians break noses. For now though, the House of Lords is absolutely fucking mental! The House of Lords is an archaic remnant of history in which completely unelected droogs approve and amend laws passed by the House of Commons. These greying wax mannequins and Sleepy Joe impersonators are shoved in by Prime Ministers, but they get to keep the job for life. The whole chamber is undemocratic, unrepresentative, and by and large, they're accountable to almost no one. And speaking of archaic remnants of history accountable to no one, hello! The King of England, who at the moment is this sausage-fingered crustacean, has absolute power within these isles. In theory, anyway. All laws technically have to be approved by him, as does the Prime Minister. Of course, the English monarchy hasn't had any real power in a very, very, very long time, and these days they more or less just rubber stamp anything that Parliament gives them, which kinda makes you wonder, what's the fucking point in any of this? So in summary then, the UK is a country made up of 4 sort of countries, 3 of which can sort of govern themselves, but basically England still has the final say over pretty much everything. We're voting a system that doesn't work and gives us governments that most of us hate, and that's only in one chamber of our parliament, with the other being made up of unelected fucking droogs. Oh, and also we're all still ruled by a fucking monarch. Somehow in the year 2024. Fucking hell, they've dug Alex Salmond out of his grave. We're still technically under the thumb of a homeopath. He also killed his wife. And this isn't even to mention all of the empire stuff, like how Charlie Boy is also the king of fucking Australia for some reason. We didn't mention the thousands of islands in the middle of nowhere that we use as tax havens. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I didn't even mention how this Pizza Express enjoyer, who definitely can't sweat, was paid by the UK government, i.e. the British public, to sell arms to terrorists and dictatorships in the Middle East. Fucking hell. The Conservative Party has been in power for 14 years, with their hands firmly choking Westminster since 2010. We'll get into how they actually managed to do that later, but first it might be useful to take a look at what happened the last time the country went to shit under their watch. It's 1979 and the UK is going to shit. Sky high inflation, trade union disputes, strikes, shortages. It was like now. And to think that only 34 years ago did this country single-handedly win the Second World War. We used to be an empire. We used to rule the waves. Now we can't even get our fucking bins collected. We need to shake things up. We need a fresh, radical vision for the nation. And maybe we should declare war with Argentina. Margaret Thatcher is one of the most famous and divisive figures in recent political memory. From out of relatively humble origins, she rose through the Conservative ranks while they were in opposition. In 1975, she won a leadership contest, beating former Prime Minister and literal paedophile Sir Edward Heath to become the first female leader of any major party in Britain. During the turbulent 1970s, the UK economy was in the shit, and it was becoming clear to everyone that, well, the country just didn't matter as much as it used to. There were similar problems all over the West, particularly in regards to the economy because of oil and wars and shit. In reaction to this, there was a growing movement of conservatives who wanted to deregulate vast chunks of the economy, who wanted to stick it to the trade unions, privatise everything and anything, and keep taxes for the rich super low, because somehow that money's gonna trickle down to the rest of society just on its own. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, actually that sounds pretty reasonable to me, what's the problem? Well, we'll get into that. People like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher loved all this shit. They ate it up. And the worst part is that they were so popular that their rivals started eating it up too. Broadly speaking, you can describe Thatcher and Reagan as being neoliberals. Famously, Bill Clinton is also a neoliberal, as is his wife, as is Tony Blair. Thatcher was once asked what her greatest legacy was, and she replied, "Tony Blair and New Labour. We forced our opponents to change their minds." If you don't know who Tony Blair is, he's the best that fucking Labour can come up with. And he's also a war criminal. Well, they've certainly got a lot in common. So what I'm basically saying is, although the mainstream parties might look as if they're really different from each other and they might make a big deal out of it, it's Thatcherism. It's still fucking Thatcherism. Thatcher's greatest legacy, Blair, was initially incredibly popular while in office, until he started needing a chapstick from all the time he spent sucking off George W. Bush's weapon of mass destruction. I think that's the best joke I've ever written. Blair resigned in 2007 and was succeeded by another neoliberal, his Chancellor Gordon Brown. Least worst Prime Minister, by the way, in my opinion. Brown lost the 2010 election to David Cameron, who described himself as an heir to Blair. So yeah, that's another neoliberal. Cameron resigned for, well, we'll get into that later, and was then replaced by, it's all of them. Broadly speaking, the economic policy of this country has not changed in the last 40 years. Well, apart from that one massive exception, but we'll get into that later. Now, if you're someone who buys into this crap and thinks that 4 decades of Thatcherism is a good idea, that is so fucking cringe. The deregulation of vast sections of the economy led to the rise in the use of tax havens and archaic loopholes, exploiting Britain's weird ancient legal system to turn London into the favourite city of Russian mobsters and Saudi princes to hide their money in. Nearly 40% of dirty money in the world is laundered in London and UK Crown dependencies. That is fucking bonkers. 40 fucking % of dirty money in the fucking world goes through London. I have no words. In America, mass deregulation covered things like the banking sector, who were gradually allowed to do more and more crazy shit that I frankly do not understand well enough to be able to explain to you. Go watch The Big Short, leading to the financial fuckity meltdown of 2008. Trickle-down economics, or the idea that if you tax the super wealthy comparatively very little, then they'll take that money that would have gone to taxes and they'll invest it into society themselves, isn't true. It's been proven that it doesn't work. It's fucking fantasy. So much so that I'm not even going to take it seriously. I'm not even going to put a source in. Have you met my friend Liz, by the way? The mass privatisation of major industries was devastating across the UK. Many towns in Scotland, Wales and the north of England were entirely reliant on nationalised industries such as coal, steel, shipbuilding and car manufacturing, industries which collapsed under Thatcherism. In 1970, the UK's manufacturing industry made up 20.6% of the country's GDP. In 2023, it was just 9%. This is a quote from the Economic Journal, brought to you by the Twits at Oxford, i.e. exactly the kind of people who would wet the bed with excitement at the thought of Thatcher's ghost trickling down on them. Neither the specific problem of deindustrialisation nor the consequent general problem of fucking hell, these people really do go to Oxford, don't they? Okay, in plain English, what they said was Thatcherism and deindustrialisation only worsened the decline of British manufacturing, and the real cause of the decline in the British manufacturing industry was underinvestment and a lack of modernisation. I want you to remember that phrase, because if there are 2 problems that have been consistently fucking this country into the ground, then it's these bad boys. There is no money, there is no vision. And all we're doing is just slowly declining and declining, just fucking drowning ourselves in shite that we're pumping out from the fucking sewage plants directly into the goddamn rivers. Anyway, where were we? Thatcher was deposed by her own party after one scandal too many. And by the way, I barely got into the Falklands War. I didn't even mention how she was negotiating with the IRA while publicly condemning negotiating with the IRA, or how she taxed Scottish people for a year for being Scottish, or how she ate puppies and drank the blood of orphans every night to stay alive. After Thatcher came John Major, who was... Then after him came Blair, and now you're pretty much up to speed on the history of modern British politics. Until... When Labour were in charge last time, it wasn't perfect, but a few good things did come out of it. Devolution, the policy that led to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland each getting their own governments for one. National minimum wage, free museum admission, that one is brilliant, love that. The NHS was performing so well. Blair was once attacked by an audience member at some question time thing because it was too quick.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but surely they're not saying to you that you have to have it quicker than you wanted. Well...
In 2010, following the Iraq War, the resignation of Tony Blair, and the 2008 financial crisis, PM Gordon Brown was in a bit of a tricky situation. He was perceived by many as being awkward and blundering, as if he wasn't a proper person, like he'd just been born, aged 60 years and forced to run the country. Countering him was a similar non-human called David Cameron, who I'll always remember for as the Prime Minister who put his fucking cock in a dead pig's mouth. It's hard to say whether the pig rumour is actually true. I suppose he could have just got confused and fucked Boris Johnson instead. Spoil the fucking difference, cause I can't see one. The pig fucker was more popular than Scotland's most charismatic history graduate, but Cameron still wasn't popular outright because there was one other supposed human in the race. And the twist for this one, he actually did seem like a real person. So far I've only really talked about Labour and the Conservatives, with the Conservatives being the broadly centre-right party, though recently not so centre-right, and the Labour Party being the broadly centre-left one, although their version of centre-left is just being slightly more left than whatever the Tories are doing. Now the third biggest party, well until today anyway, the third biggest party was, you know, we'll get into them later. The new third biggest party are the Liberal Democrats. So a bit of a history lesson for you, like 100 years ago, the Liberal Democrats, or Liberals as they were known then, were the biggest left-wing party, but over time that gradually shifted and it became Labour instead. And so for the last 100 years, the Liberal Democrats have sort of just been, I don't know, kind of useless. In theory, they're a halfway point between people who want to vote Conservative and Labour, but actually that is not true. They're really just the party for Labour voters who don't want to vote Labour. Of course, all that actually achieves is splitting the vote, but we've been over that. I'm filming this very out of order. At the moment, they're doing the bit where Starmer's gone off to ask the king if he can do democracy. This country's so weird. I met a Danish girl on my travels and now I'm a fucking Zin addict. Anyway, I don't care to watch any of that nonsense. So let me tell you about 2010. So in 2010, going into the election, Nick Clegg wasn't really that well known. He was the same as any other Liberal Democrat leader. Pretty obscure. However, during this leaders' debate, he actually made the most of it, and he appealed to people who wanted a third way in our political system.
I believe the way things are is not the way things have to be. Now, you're going to be told tonight by these two that the only choice you can make is between two old parties who've been running things for years. I'm here to persuade you that there is an alternative.
After this, the press were all over him. People started to really hype him up. By all accounts, the pitch worked, mainly because he came across like an actual person. In the 2005 election, the Lib Dems got just 22% of the vote, but this time with this hot, sleek new option coming the voters' way, it was time for real change. 22% in 2005, in 2010, 23% of the vote, 1% more. Fucking nail that! In the end, neither Labour nor the Conservatives were big enough to be able to form a government following the election. However, if either of them formed a coalition with the Lib Dems, then they would be able to make it work. And it could have been either of them. After all, the Lib Dems are supposedly meant to be politically somewhere between Labour and the Tories anyway. The funny thing is, despite gaining a percentage of the popular vote, they actually lost 5 seats. Our electoral system really is fucked. If the Lib Dems teamed up with the Conservatives, that would have been 57 plus 306 equals 363, very healthily over the line for a majority. Whereas with Labour, it would have been 57 plus 258, which equals 315, which is less than a dozen short of a majority. Now, although that's not as healthy an option, 11 is not that big of a gap. It is reasonable to assume a minority government could have passed legislation with the help from other small parties and some occasionally dissenting Tories. But why shouldn't they just team up with the Tories and be in government properly? Well, firstly because ideologically they have way more in common with Labour than they do with the Conservatives, and secondly, the Lib Dems teaming up with the Conservatives would be like a sheep getting into bed with a lion. They would be fucked over and ripped apart from the inside, consistently, but they would be in power, and Nick Clegg would get to matter. For once. So Clegg made a deal with the devil. He teamed up with Cameron to form a coalition, thus ushering in a new shiny era of Conservative government. So how'd it go? The Lib Dems' key pledge during the 2010 election was to scrap university tuition fees. This was their main thing to entice young people to vote for them, so it was really important that they saw this go through. Did the coalition scrap tuition fees? No. No, they didn't.
Broken promises. There have been too many in the last few years, too many in the last 30 years. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry.
What the Lib Dems really wanted to do was scrap first past the post so that we have a voting system that, you know, actually makes some fucking sense. If we changed the system, it would have meant that smaller parties like the Lib Dems would have actually mattered more than just this one time. But seeing as the Conservatives needed the Lib Dems far more than the Lib Dems needed the Conservatives, you would have thought that Clegg would have really hammered this point home. No ifs, no buts. Change the voting system or we're gonna go with Labour instead, is what Clegg should have said to the pig fucker. Instead they held a referendum on it in 2011 in which both the Tories and Labour made sure everyone in Britain knew it was a terrible idea, and basically everyone has forgotten this even happened. Only 40% of people showed up for it, with almost 70% of voters choosing to keep first past the post. So in short, basically the Lib Dems achieved literally nothing in government except for ushering in the Tories. Thanks for nothing, Nick. Yeah, then he went to America and he got a job working for Facebook. Forget the pointless referendum. What 2011 was really big for was civil disobedience, as it was the last time, as of making this video anyway, that there was mass rioting throughout the country. Sparked by a police shooting in London, rioting spread to other cities like Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool. You could almost say that underneath the surface of British society there was a growing resentment and anger towards the establishment, and a desire for a radical change that wasn't being met by the stooges running the show.
Who are those who've been robbing and stealing, that they will be caught, they will be apprehended. Can you hear me at the back? Well, perhaps where are you? You're over there.
Yes, exactly.
Speaking of violence, 2011 was also the year that saw the overthrow and killing of Libya's crackpot dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Cameron and his European allies were pretty big on pushing the Obama administration and supporting Libyan rebels who were against Gaddafi's regime. Here's Cameron and former French President Sarkozy promising in the aftermath Libya would not be allowed to turn into another Iraq, though of course that's exactly what fucking happened. 2012 had the Olympic Games, making it probably the last good year in this country anyone can remember. Meanwhile, Cameron's lot was sticking it to the benefit scroungers. A real golden age Cameron policy that I remember was the bedroom tax, which basically, if you were on housing support, then you would get less of it if you had a spare bedroom. This was to encourage people to move out of homes that they were under occupying. Your benefit would be reduced by 14% if you had one spare bedroom and 25% if you had two or more. I can think of quite a few potentially good reasons why you might need a spare bedroom if you're on housing benefit. Maybe the way to deal with a housing crisis isn't by taking away people's benefits for having a spare room. Maybe the way to solve it is, well, I don't know, building some more fucking houses? As mentioned earlier, these two factors are the key reason I'd say Britain is feeling. This was bad already, but got cataclysmic under the Cameron administration. Let's look at this horrifying graph, showing how the real-term spending of the NHS has changed over time. Under Labour, spending increased each year by 5.5%. As soon as Cameron came into power, that fell to just 1%. Austerity was a contributing factor to declining resilience in the NHS in the years leading up to the pandemic, hampering its ability to manage the shock of COVID. Today, more than 2,000 NHS buildings in England are older than the NHS itself. That means at least 1 in 4 NHS buildings in England are about as old as Joe Biden. And these buildings are literally crumbling with sewage leaks, collapsing ceilings and floors. Jesus Christ. These are supposed to be hospitals, for fuck's sake. There was a hospital where a ceiling collapsed onto a patient who was on life support and a falling lift broke a doctor's leg. At a hospital. And all of this can be traced back to austerity, underinvestment and a lack of modernisation. Before we start talking about that big sexy referendum, let's first talk strategy. So a party's director of strategy, really their job is kind of road mapping PR in relation to policy, I suppose. For example, one guy, Dominic Cummings, was very influential to the Boris Johnson administration, and we'll be getting into that later. In 2010 until 2012, the director of strategy for David Cameron was this man, Steve Hilton. This is more or less the guy who shaped the early Conservative agenda. So what do you think it says about that agenda when in the years after leaving government, our boy Steve here got a job at Fox News, where among other things he claimed the chief medical advisor to the president, Dr. Anthony Fauci, commissioned COVID-19's development, and then he completely bought into Trump's claims of election fraud in 2020, something no state or federal court has taken seriously. That's the guy who was leading the Conservative strategy under the coalition. And what the fuck is this? Who looked at this and said yes? Good fucking job. The only thing revolting here is your fucking fashion sense. The Cameron years were shit, but they weren't entirely hopeless. It was only after a famous referendum that things really started to go downhill. So let's talk about Scotland. So this is as good a time as any to re-acknowledge the fact that there are places that exist that aren't England. While the Conservatives and Labour, and to a lesser extent the Lib Dems, have been fighting out England in this election, in Scotland it's a very different story. Before Scotland had its own parliament, the SNP, or Scottish National Party, always tended to do pretty badly in elections because, you know, they didn't want to be part of the UK. But when Scotland got its own sort of government, it allowed them to make a bigger name for themselves, till eventually in 2007 when they unseated Labour and began their 17-year-long rule over Holyrood. The SNP's first leader was this man, Alex Salmond, who is, to be honest, even most of us Nats have gone off him in recent years. Anyway, the sliminess of our country and indeed my party's leaders aside, why the hell should you suddenly care about this? Unlike with UK elections, devolved governments are not voted in by first past the post. You can rank your candidates in order of preference, which makes for far more representative results, and it also means you very, very rarely get single parties taking a big majority of seats. Anyway, that wasn't until 2011 when the SNP got the majority of the seats in the Scottish Parliament. Now this was a political fucking earthquake, right? The devolved government system is designed in such a way that no single party should be able to get a majority of the seats, and yet they did it anyway. This was the only time this has happened in Scotland's history. This has never happened in Wales. This has never happened in Northern Ireland. So it was a pretty fucking big deal, right? It was a huge mandate for the independence cause, so Cameron naturally congratulated Salmond on his big 6 win, and a referendum was arranged. Now I'm not going to drag you too much through the mud regarding this particular referendum, because, well, to be honest, I might cover it more if it's 10-year anniversary in September. But one thing I do remember from the time was that a lot of the Remainers were saying, well, if Scotland leaves the UK, then they'll also have to leave the EU. You don't want to leave the EU, do you? Stick with us, stay in the UK, you'll be alright. On the eve of the referendum, the pig fucker, the wuss, and this guy who's in charge of Labour, actually he really doesn't matter, all pledged to give the Scottish Parliament new powers if Scotland stayed in the Union. This vow was printed front and centre on the Daily Record. The people of Scotland want to know that all three main parties will deliver change for Scotland. See page 22 for free milk. This vow didn't actually mention anything concrete, it was really just like a vague promise, and 55% of people actually bought into it. Did any substantial change actually occur? Take a wild fucking guess. Think our former leader might be regretting sitting with the ITV news crowd this election night. Yeah, but we're SNP's fucked. Kinda deserved. Let's fucking get this party started. Well, you all know what happened next. 2015 had been a funny year for Cameron. On the plus side, the Conservatives won a surprise victory in the 2015 election, winning a majority outright, thus bringing an end to the coalition and putting the Lib Dems back out of government where they damn well belong. Part of the reason credited to this win was the Conservatives promising to hold a referendum on whether or not the UK should leave the European Union. Although we now think of the Conservatives as being the architects of Brexit, back then the party was split on the issue. Cameron himself was personally very pro-Remain and campaigned hard against the vote that he called for. Even Thatcher was pro-EU. Fashion fucking icon. You know, looking at this makes me want to put bleach in my eyes. Actually, I want to do that every time I see a picture of Thatcher. The reason for Cameron calling this referendum was because another political party, who we haven't mentioned yet, had been bleeding Conservative votes for years, and this was his way of winning them back. Whereas on the right, there's mainly just the Conservatives. Your tiny, massive little fucking asterisks there. Let me introduce to you UKIP, the UK Independence Party. UKIP was more or less a single issue party that was devoted to making Brexit happen. Their leader was this man, Nigel Farage, who unfortunately I'm gonna have to talk about quite a lot throughout the rest of this video. In the 2015 election, the Conservatives got 37% of the vote, but UKIP got 12.5% of the vote, meaning that if all of those UKIP voters went for the Tories instead, which, well, they probably would, then the Conservatives would have gotten the majority of the popular vote. God damn. So Cameron promising the Brexit referendum was his way of winning those voters back. Lest we forget, quite a lot of Conservatives within his party also wanted Brexit to happen. So to stop his party bleeding votes and also to keep his party together, Cameron arranged for a fucking referendum on whether or not the UK should leave or remain in the EU. Even though he thought it was a fucking terrible idea. Really what he did was put the Conservative Party's interests ahead of the country's interests. That might be a running theme later. Right, time to introduce you to some people. These are the 4 horsemen of the Brexit apocalypse. Except they're not riding horses, they're all squished together in a fucking clown car. Cameron and Farage, you know, Cameron was the one who called the referendum under pressure from Farage's party. The third man is this little weasel, Dominic Cummings. And he was, among other things, the chief strategist of the Vote Leave campaign. That's the campaign which famously brought you this lie on the back of a bus. Most of that campaign was built on lies actually, like how they said the EU was going to accept Turkey, thus causing a flood of immigration, even though it's been 8 years and the chances of this actually happening look about as likely as me becoming the fucking Pope. Conservative leader of the House of Commons and potentially future leader of the Conservative Party, Penny Mordaunt, wait, hang on, never mind. Former potential leader of the Conservative Party, Penny Mordaunt, said to the Sunday Express in 2016, if the UK remains under Brussels control, it will be forced to join an EU army. 8 years later, and that still hasn't happened. Now maybe that one will happen within our lifetimes, but due to recent events, that might not be such a bad idea. Anyway, the Leave campaign was full of lies. Cummings' big strategy was to lie to everybody, but you probably already knew that. There are actually 2 Leave campaigns, by the way. One was Vote Leave, which had all the actual politicians and Cummings in it, and the other was Leave.eu, which had Farage, and was the campaign that showed off this poster on the day Labour MP Joe Cox was assassinated by a far-right extremist. For some bizarre reason, this part doesn't really get mentioned. These days when talking about the campaign, most people tend to just talk about that fucking bus, but a member of the UK Parliament was murdered. The last time that happened prior to this was in 1990, and that was by the IRA. She seems to have been a really good MP as well. Yeah, what can you say? Oh yeah, I almost forgot. We've still got one more horseman of the Brexit apocalypse to talk about. So let's talk about Boris Johnson. Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson was born into wealth and privilege. He attended Eton, which was that weird school where Cameron fucked that pig. He worked as a journalist for some time, but in 1988 the young Johnson was sacked from the Times for fabricating a quote in an article, and in 2004 he was relieved of his duties as Shadow Arts Minister for the Tory party for allegedly lying about an extramarital affair. I've just ripped that off from this article by The Independent titled, "Why Are We So Surprised That Boris Johnson Lied When He's Been Sacked for Lying Twice Before?" An article which was published in 2016, 3 years before he became Prime Minister. I bet that goes really well. In 2008, he ran for Mayor of London against Labour incumbent Ken Livingstone and stunned everybody by actually winning. In his acceptance speech, Johnson, a journalist who first made his name as a national figure as a contestant on Have I Got News For You, acknowledged that many voters would have had their pencils hovering for a moment before they ticked the box on the ballot paper beside his name. Where have I heard that before?
And those whose pencils may have wavered over the ballot. I'm not aware of the David Cameron.
You're not aware of anything, Mark.
By far, his high point as mayor was when he got stuck on a zip line. No, that really was the high point. During his time as mayor, Johnson said he wouldn't return to Parliament so that he could focus on running London, which was a lie, and he became the MP for a Tory safe seat in 2015. So this extremely privileged, bumbling, entitled, lying pseudo-celebrity wasn't actually sure where he stood on the whole Brexit thing. You see, before the vote, Johnson was expected to write a piece in the Telegraph, a paper so out of touch I'm surprised its readers managed to make it out of the 1840s. Johnson published this article: "There is only one way to get the change we want, vote to leave the EU." But he also wrote another article that wasn't published which said the reverse. Quote, "This is a market on our doorstep ready for further exploitation," interesting word, "by British firms. The membership fee seems rather small for all that access. Why are we so determined to turn our back on it?" Why indeed. Now, some people have interpreted this to mean that Johnson never really believed that much in Brexit. Instead, this was all a rather cynical ploy to set himself up as future leader of the party. Of course, he'd wind up leading a lot of parties. You see, he'd always had this long-standing rivalry with his pig-fucking school chum. When he was a boy, he said he wanted to be fucking world king or something. So he always wanted to be Prime Minister, and Brexit was his way of setting himself up against Cameron. See, if Boris Johnson became the main face of the Leave campaign, if he was to become the main Brexit guy, then everyone who thought that leaving was a good idea would get behind him. And besides, no one thinks that this Brexit thing is actually going to happen, so it's not going to matter. The UK will carry on just the same as normal, and when Cameron eventually resigns in a couple years' time, Boris will be there to take his place. Well, that almost worked out. Very nearly. After the referendum, it became immediately apparent that nobody had a plan on what to do if the UK actually voted to leave, because no one in charge actually expected the UK to vote to leave, including Johnson. By the way, notice how fucking depressed he seems here despite just winning this thing?
I know I speak for Michael in saying how sad I am.
Despite saying he would stay on as Prime Minister regardless of the vote's outcome, David Cameron instead decided to resign in disgrace and go on 4 fucking holidays after the vote was held.
If the British people vote to leave the European Union, will the Prime Minister remain in office to implement their decision?
Yes.
Fuck you! You just got
Ushering in a new era for the Conservative Party. Thanks, Dave. You literally fucked up everything and then ran away like a coward. Johnson ran for the leadership to replace Cameron, and it looked like he was going to win it too. But unfortunately, his best bum buddy and 8-time most punchable chipmunk winner, Michael Gove, came out and stabbed him in the back by announcing his own leadership bid, which only made Johnson look incompetent and Gove look like a shifty double-crosser. Because he was. He was this cartoon, basically. In the wake of the Tory infighting, a new challenger emerged. Home Secretary Theresa May, who was another fucking neoliberal and also a Remainer. So you had someone leading the Brexit negotiations now who didn't actually believe in Brexit. The whole reason Cameron resigned was because he didn't believe in Brexit. So this can only go well. Okay, credit where it's due. She's probably the least worst out of the 5 Connors who've been running this shit pile island over the last 14 years. Or she's the least offensive. But that's kind of like saying you've got internal hemorrhoids. The least worst kind. For the first year in office, May didn't really do Anything? Well, apart from the usual austerity, illegal arms sales, and generally being a cunt.
Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit.
Because she was elected by the Conservative Party, not the people, some thought that May didn't really have a mandate as leader and she should call an election to solidify her position, but she repeatedly ruled this out, so I guess that's not happening.
He agreed that the government should call a general election.
The only notable thing about this election campaign was Theresa May's response to the question, "What's the naughtiest thing you've done?"
I have to confess, when me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat, the farmers weren't too pleased about that.
How embarrassing. If I were her, I'd have said selling arms to Saudi Arabia, which were then used in the conflict in Yemen, a conflict which has killed almost 400,000 people. 70% of deaths are from children under the age of 5. That's what I would have said. It's just a bit more exciting than the fields of wheat thing, you know? Theresa May did not have a particularly commanding personality. She was more of a background person. In fact, she was so far in the background, you might not have even noticed she was there. Anyway, you remember how in 2015 Cameron won the election outright, meaning that for the first time since 1992, the Conservatives had a full majority in Westminster? Yeah, well, May took that majority and pissed it away. And the biggest blunder of her premiership, she came back from the 2017 results with less seats than she had started, meaning the Conservatives had to go back into coalition. The Lib Dems had got wise to Tory shenanigans by this point, so instead, May teamed up with Arlene Foster, head of the DUP. Okay, I'm determined not to go into a full Northern Irish politics tangent because we'll be here all fucking day, but briefly, the DUP are the Christian fucking fundamentalist Northern Irish party that is for Northern Ireland staying in the UK. I say Christian fundamentalist because some of their MPs' views include opposing equal marriage, opposing abortions, even for rape victims. A lot of them are climate change skeptics, and also their former leader is a rapist. Allegedly. This match made from hell had a combined 327 seats in Parliament, and you need 326 to form a majority, so this was cutting things pretty damn fine. Now those of you paying attention will have just noticed that this very thin coalition is between the Conservatives, the party negotiating Brexit, and the DUP, the Northern Irish party nearly solely dedicated to keeping Northern Ireland within the UK. Right, I can see some problems here. Right, so once upon a time, Ireland was part of the UK. It isn't anymore. This part stayed behind, and a lot of people in the Republic of Ireland weren't too happy about that, and so decades of war ensued. One of Old Man Blair's greatest achievements was this thing called the Good Friday Agreement, which, among a lot of other things, guaranteed that there would never be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Which didn't really matter anyway, because once relations normalised and we stopped murdering each other, because we were both EU nations, the UK and the Republic of Ireland, we had free movement of people. So there was no need to even consider the issue of the border. Until obviously fucking Brexit. So you've got three fucking options here. Option 1, you put the border somewhere between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which the DUP are never gonna fucking vote for. Option 2, you put the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Yeah, that's probably gonna start a war, so maybe don't do that one. And then option 3 is basically, don't do Brexit. No, seriously, those were the options. Oh, by the way, Northern Ireland as well as Scotland did not vote for Brexit, so thanks for that, England. You too, Wales. Do you fucking realise how many small communities were reliant on EU funding? When it comes to Brexit, I'm purely Scottish. Forget the dual nationality thing. Anyway, so the DUP are point blank refusing any Brexit deal that puts a barrier between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. But if May puts the border across Ireland, there's a very real likelihood that she's going to reignite a fucking war, and then God knows what else. And so the debate goes on, and all the while it feels as if this country is slowly burning to the ground.
More than 50 injured and many feared dead as a tower block in West London is engulfed in flames.
You could hear people basically begging for their lives.
I heard a lot of screams, and you could see people banging on the windows, and there was fire all around him. It was horrendous.
Screaming, I've got a baby, please help me get out, I can't get out, I'm trapped, I need to save my baby.
In my 29 years of being a firefighter, I have never ever seen it.
It's like a waterfall, a fire, a flame.
6 days after the general election, in the early hours of the 14th of June, a kitchen fire broke out on the 4th floor of a tower block in London. Within 2 hours, the entire building was ablaze. 72 people lost their lives in absolutely horrific circumstances, including 15 disabled residents and 17 children. The fire spread so fast due to unsafe, highly flammable material being used to make up large parts of the building. This shouldn't have been allowed to happen, obviously, and should have been regulated, but whoops! The FBU, which is the union for firefighters in the UK, very helpfully put together this report where we can sort of take a look at where the blame lies and why this tragedy happened. First page, straight to the point. For at least 40 years, policies relating to housing, local government, the fire and rescue service, research and other areas have been driven by the agenda of cuts, deregulation and privatisation, austerity, deregulation and privatisation by consecutive governments bears ultimate responsibility for the Grenfell tragedy. Every government, including and since Thatcher, is responsible. Can we please stop doing neoliberalism? Today, coming close to a decade later, this same highly flammable material is still in hundreds of buildings. There is nothing stopping this from happening again. This is what austerity looks like. At that year's Conservative Party conference, you started to get the impression that the Conservatives weren't just evil, money-grubbing bastards, but also they're just plainly incompetent.
I hold my hands up for that. I take responsibility. I led the campaign, and I am sorry.
In case you missed that, that's a room full of Tories clapping for their leader who just admitted their campaign was a fucking disaster. As well as a persistent cough, she also got handed this resignation letter. Why did she take it like that?
Boris, job done there. Given her the P45.
Well, next year's conference can't be any worse.
I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold.
May tried to get Brexit to work. She really did, but at the end of the day, she was about as useful as a gas-based vibrator. Just not feeling it. She was a fucking walking gaff magnet, right? And it really is not that much of an exaggeration to say that during her premiership she did fuck all. Her time as PM just dragged on and on until eventually she finally fucking topped herself, becoming the second Prime Minister in a row to resign in disgrace.
The second female Prime Minister, but certainly not the last.
Yeah, no shit.
But with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
You know, this moment really did quite a lot to humanise me to a lot of people. Admittedly, myself included a bit, but it's still Theresa May. Like, calm down. It's still the woman who didn't meet the survivors of Grenfell. And she also changed the law under Cameron as Home Secretary so that migrant workers working here under abusive or exploitative employers couldn't switch jobs without being booted out. Oh, and I did mention the arms sales thing, right? So Theresa May is no fucking hero. She ain't no diamond in the rough. It's just that the rough is so thoroughly coated in horseshit that just a small turd doesn't really seem that big of a deal. Speaking of human shit, who came after her? Following the second Tory party leadership contest since Cameron's resignation, Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson became Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister on the 24th of July 2019. He appointed Dominic Cummings as his senior advisor. Oh fucking great. Just a month into the job, he was already tearing up the rulebook. There was this weird law where, I'm not paying £100 for stock footage, where a Prime Minister can get a monarch to suspend Parliament whenever, which hadn't been used in ages. In fact, this law gets so rarely used that you can count on a single hand how many times Parliament has been suspended in this way. And that includes the time where Parliament and the King went to fucking war with each other like 5 million years ago. The law itself is a remnant from back in the days where the King basically ran the country by himself. So what was Johnson trying to do here? He couldn't get Parliament to agree on a Brexit deal, which was the whole reason why May resigned in the first place. Now, because Johnson was a fucking lunatic, in his mind it would have been better if the UK just left the EU without a deal. Just crashed straight out there. Now, as you can imagine, a lot of people in Parliament thought the UK leaving the world's largest trading bloc without any plans on what to do next was a bad idea. Parliament wasn't going to let him do that, so he suspended Parliament early, basically organising it so that Parliament would meet again after the UK had already left the EU. Suspending Parliament like this, it's not very democratic really, is it? The Speaker of the House, who sort of runs the debates and is supposed to stay impartial, said it was a constitutional outrage. Mind you, Baker wasn't a typical speaker, but still. However it is dressed up, it is blindingly obvious that the purpose of suspending Parliament now would be to stop MPs debating Brexit and performing its duty in shaping a course for the country. A few days later, the Supreme Court ruled this was completely unlawful, and so Parliament was reinstated. It was also found that while Johnson was getting Liz to do this, he'd lied to her in order to get it done. And so a defeated Johnson and the rest of Parliament went back to Westminster. But the issue of Brexit hadn't gone away, and so to try and get more loyalist MPs, Johnson called yet another election. You'd have thought a guy who just put the UK's economy on the line while also lying to the Queen and trying to be a dictator would have gone into an election being incredibly unpopular, but this is the UK. Under May, the Conservatives seemed increasingly tired and set to lose power, but annoyingly Johnson gave the party a new lease of life. The party, or rather party leader, who was seemingly getting tired of doing this shit, was this man, Jeremy Corbyn, head of the Labour Party. Hey, we haven't heard from Labour in a while. How are they doing?
I just can't do it. I can't take this shit no more, man.
Following Labour's defeat and Brown's resignation in 2010, Labour had a leadership contest between these two brothers. This one stabbed the other in the back and was then seen as geeky, awkward, and also he couldn't eat a bacon sandwich properly. At least he didn't try and fuck it. After losing the 2015 election, which most people expected Labour to win, this guy resigned and so Labour held another leadership contest. A few Labour members decided that, for once, instead of being only slightly better than the Tories and nominating yet another neoliberal as leader, maybe they could elect someone who was actually left-wing, you know, just for a change. Jeremy Corbyn had been an MP for decades. He was a socialist and during the Blair administration very vocally opposed the Iraq War. Election of backbench MP and anti-war campaigner means party now has one of the most left-wing anti-establishment leaders in its history. So how did the establishment and press react to this? I invite you to watch this video by HBomberGuy about the 2017 election, where he pretty much sets out why leftists like Jeremy Corbyn, and also therefore why the right-wing media fucking attacked him so hard. There's a bit in HBomb's video where a conservative newspaper publishes a fan-fiction dystopia predicting how within 1,000 days Corbyn would have literally destroyed Britain. The night sky over London was thick with choke and black smoke, but in the hellish glow of the flames rising from a myriad... shouldn't that be myriad of burning buildings? The rioters, looters and demonstrators fighting on the city streets could just make out the United Nations helicopter taking Jeremy Corbyn away from 10 Downing Street to his retirement cottage in Ireland. He doesn't even have a cottage in Ireland. What are you fucking on about? The far left had always believed that their inability to win elections was due to the machinations of right-wing press barons who poisoned the people's minds against them.
How can you not realise that you are doing that? You're literally publishing fan fiction in which Jeremy Corbyn destroys Britain. What the fuck?
So I'm not a Labour guy, but it was nice to see one of the leaders of the two main parties who wasn't just another neoliberal sucking on the ghost of Thatcher's dick. That being said, Corbyn did have some problems. His biggest one was that he believed in actual left-wing policies which threatened to disrupt the establishment. Which, you know, is a good thing, but it was still a problem for him when the establishment mercilessly attacked him for years on end. A supposedly biased left-wing BBC recut this interview to make him look bad. Fucking coonsbug. The thing is, Corbyn was terrible at dealing with this. I would describe a lot of Corbyn's interactions with the press as combative, which you might think is fair enough. I mean, they were being actively hostile towards him. But if you want to become Prime Minister, you've got to play the game of politics, right? Sometimes you've got to be charming even to your political enemies, and Corbyn just did not have the patience for that. One thing that really stuck was accusations of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. I found these accusations to be highly exaggerated by the press when you consider the Tory party's problems with Islamophobia, which hardly ever seem to get a mention, or the very rampant transphobia which we've seen in more recent years. However, my fucking god, did Corbyn handle this really, really badly.
Against the abuse they receive on the streets, on the trains, or in any other
apology for how you handled
other
this.
form of life.
I'll try one more time.
No,
No
hang on a
apology.
minute, Andrew. Can I explain what we're trying to do?
You have, and you've been given plenty of time to do it. I asked you if you wanted to apologise.
Andrew,
and you
I
haven't.
don't want anyone to go through what anyone has gone
And you've
through.
said that several times. I understand that, Mr. Corbyn.
That is not a good look. Well, Andrew, I'm really glad you asked me that because I want to offer my full and sincere apologies for how the Labour Party has handled this, even if it was just 0.3% of our members. As party leader, that still falls on my shoulders, and I want everyone to know that I'm very sorry, and we as a party will not let you down again. Thank you, Mr. Corbyn. Yeah, fuck off, you prick. Even if, like me, you view this whole thing as kind of a stitch-up, Corbyn still should have accepted personal responsibility in every interview he gave, otherwise he was just feeding the narrative. An incredibly unfair one considering that he spent all of his life fighting discrimination, but most people don't know that. The average vote on the street doesn't know that. They just hear Labour leader refuses to apologise over anti-Semitism row. The game might be wank, but you still got to play. Oh, and there was also his Brexit bullshit. While not being anywhere near on the same level as someone like Farage, Corbyn was sceptical, let's say, about the EU's globalist, mostly conservative way of doing things. This meant the official opposition didn't do that much opposing during the referendum, which really pissed off a lot of pro-Remain Labour supporters. In 2019, Corbyn offered the people a second referendum, this time for realsies, which really pissed off a lot of pro-Leave Labour supporters. One area particularly miffed was the north of England, which historically has been shafted about the same as us Celts, which is perhaps why they voted so thoroughly for Brexit. Most of the north hadn't voted Conservative since Thatcher closed the coal mines, but in 2019 those voters turned Tory, which was massive for UK politics. They wanted to get Brexit done, and this guy wasn't gonna do it. So the Conservatives want Brexit no matter what. Labour can't make up its mind. So where do all the die-hard Remain people go? The Lib Dems had been in the political wilderness ever since Clegg fucked off to Facebook, but they become relevant again in this election. And not for good reason.
Twinson's first speech as leader, setting expectations extremely high.
Let me be clear, there is no limit to my ambition for our party and our country, and today I am standing here as your candidate for Prime Minister.
It says Joe Swinson, Britain's next Prime Minister. When did you indulge in fantasy politics?
I'm a candidate to be Prime Minister. I'm a candidate to be Prime Minister.
Swinson's delusions of grandeur combined with the Liberal Democrats' unique pledge to ignore democracy was a bit of a fucking disaster for them. And while the largest alternative left-wing party was busy embarrassing itself, the largest alternative right-wing one annoyingly had its shit together.
Come in, Nigel, mate. UKIP.
Nigel.
UKIP. Right, how's it going?
Well, a lot better than this. I mean, what is going on here? This is frankly embarrassing.
UKIP are still limping on for some reason, but never mind them. The Brexit party was basically UKIP 2.0, and Farage was its leader. They were basically a party for people who were upset that Brexit was either too soft or not getting done. In the 2019 election, the party chose not to stand in seats that would have split the vote away from the Tories, thus ensuring that pretty much all potential right-wing voters went for one party, the Conservative Party. The party whose leader hid in a fridge to avoid a TV interview.
Right, he's been taken inside, into the freezer.
He's gone into the fridge.
There's a bunker.
The collapse of the Labour vote in the north of England, combined with the delusions of grandeur from the Lib Dems and the support of the Brexit party, meant that the Conservatives won in a landslide. And the lengthy Labour leadership election afterwards, Keir Starmer became Corbyn's apparent heir, promising to continue his legacy of fighting for actual leftist and socialist values, and giving the country the reform it desperately needs. And oh, never mind, he's basically just another version of Thatcher. Again, what's the point? What is the fucking point? So this was the biggest Conservative Party victory since the days of Thatcher, and it was the worst Labour defeat since the 1930s. The Conservatives got 14 million votes, whereas Labour got 10 million votes, so there was only a 4 million vote difference. However, the Conservatives ended up with almost 200 more seats than Labour did. If the result was proportional, the Conservatives wouldn't have even got a majority. So yeah, the system just once more demonstrating that it's completely fucked. Due to the scale of the Conservative victory, people were talking about Boris Johnson like he was the next Thatcher. Fuck, this cunt is going to be in power for like another goddamn decade. Still, what's the worst that can happen? It's not like the world was going to end.
It's been confirmed that a new virus that has killed 3 people and has been spreading across China can be passed from person to person, not just from animals.
While Brits had just come back from the poles, on the other side of the planet, probably in the Wuhan Institute of Virology if I were to take a wild guess at it, a virus was catching on faster than the clap at an orgy. Meanwhile, Johnson finally wraps up the Brexit storyline. With his sexy new parliament on side to back him, he takes Theresa May's deal, crosses out her name, writes in his own, and so Britain finally left the European Union on the 31st of January 2020. Meanwhile, COVID was rumbling ever closer, and I'm not being funny, right, but the last time I checked, the UK was an island, so we should be able to pretty easily control who comes in and out of the country. And hell, now it's the 9th of March and Italy have just put their whole country into lockdown. Things are looking pretty bad over there. Spain goes into lockdown on the 14th, France the 17th, the UK the 23rd, almost a week later. And I wonder why our death rate was so high. Actually, let's take a closer look at this. So you can see that the confirmed cases for the UK was 23 million. In France, it was 30.5 million, and in Germany, it was 29 million. However, in terms of deaths, the UK is ahead of both of those nations. In fact, excluding Russia, which is kind of a given, the UK had the highest death rate in all of Europe. In the early stages of the pandemic, many felt that Johnson just wasn't taking the threat seriously.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. You'll be pleased to know.
Johnson went into intensive care on the 6th of April, and it was around here where we start to see what Johnson will become known for. Dominic Cummings went on a fucking trip with his family to Durham and went for a drive to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight while he was experiencing COVID symptoms. What the fuck? Johnson backed Cummings going off a fucking jolly with his family and then lying about it, saying he acted with integrity. Weird he didn't mind his senior advisor breaking COVID rules. I wonder why that was. PPE manufacturing and distribution contracts for protective equipment like masks, were awarded en masse during the pandemic, as you would expect. Yeah, but £4 billion worth of it was unusable, and according to Transparency International UK, another £4 billion worth of it went to mates of Tory MPs or Tory MPs themselves. 10 Conservative MPs and Lords received £1.6 billion worth of PPE contracts directly, whether they were qualified to actually handle them or not. How the fuck is that legal, you might ask? Yeah, I'm kind of wondering the same thing. So during the pandemic, 20% of the PPE contracts were completely fucking useless, and also 20% of the contracts went to the Tories and their mates. What a coincidence. Despite trying to kill himself, Johnson survived and was eventually brought out of intensive care. Eventually, COVID starts to calm down and the first national lockdown ends. To try and inject a bit of life back into the UK economy, Johnson's new Chancellor, this cunt, devises the scheme Eat Out to Help Out, in which people were subsidised for, well, eating out. The Health Secretary, this pimp-sized sperm whale, Matt Hancock, thought this was a fucking terrible idea. He called it Eat Out to Help Out the virus. It's worth pointing out, in the years after COVID and after Johnson's eventual demise, all of his ministers turned their back on him. Basically, all of them have said that everything that went wrong was entirely Johnson's fault. All of the senior Tories are responsible for everything that went wrong during the pandemic. As much as Johnson might be a buffoon, it's not like he was the only problem within the Conservative Party. So when now Matt Hancock in 2024 says, oh, he tried to convince Johnson otherwise, he tried to tell Sunak, blah blah blah, I'm just a wee bit fucking massively skeptical about that. Anyway, the first lockdown ends, people are then basically immediately encouraged to get back interacting with each other, getting nice and close to each other, and shit, COVID deaths are rising again. Wonder how that happened. Oh, god damn. So then not long afterwards we go into the second national lockdown. Who could have predicted? How could it be that an island nation struggles so much with this? Japan didn't even have a lockdown. Their total number of deaths per 100,000 people, 43. New Zealand, 67. Taiwan, 63. Ireland, 166. The UK, 265. It might be tempting to say that no one was prepared for what happened. None of us could have done any better, surely. Well, maybe not, but I'll tell you, I doubt that I would have been bragging about shaking hands with COVID patients, because I probably wouldn't have shook hands with them in the first place. And I certainly wouldn't have awarded 20% of the country's protective equipment contracts to my mates. I'm pretty sure my mates could have handled it better than the Tories. Throughout their 14-year rule, the Tories had a habit of saying one thing only to go back on it later. For example, here's Boris Johnson attacking Donald Trump in 2015.
I think Donald Trump is clearly out of his mind.
But once it was politically advantageous for Johnson and Trump to be friends, suddenly he didn't seem to mind so much.
Donald Trump says that there are parts of London that are no-go areas. I think he's betraying a quite stupefying ignorance that makes him frankly unfit to hold the office of president.
And less than 10 years later, a Tory MP said the exact same thing and was backed up by the former Home Secretary.
A quite stupefying ignorance.
There was no consistency in their principles. They said whatever they needed to say to whoever needed to hear it. Anyway, eventually COVID is subdued, with the UK being the first nation in the world to roll out a vaccine, so fair play Bojo for that one. Even if he did say, no more fucking lockdowns, let the bodies pile high in their thousands. Yikes. Still, with COVID out the way, it's time to finally get on with this bold new Conservative vision. It's finally time to knuckle down and get back to the serious business of government. Just kidding. Let's fucking party, bitches.
It's vital that from today you minimise contact with people from outside your household. Everyone must take personal responsibility, we were advised. Hours after that tweet was posted, in the evening of the 18th, there was a Christmas party in number 10. The Mirror described how 40 or 50 people were said to have been crammed cheek by jowl into a medium-sized room. It was a COVID nightmare.
There were drinks and there were nibbles and there were games.
Drinks, nibbles, games.
Would the Prime Minister condone having a Christmas?
What's the answer?
I don't know.
While people were banned from seeing their loved ones at Christmas last year, it was fine for him and his friends to throw a boozy party in Downing Street.
It turns out that while your grandmother was dying, you lost your job, and I was stuck living university through a laptop screen, the Tories were partying away like there was no tomorrow. This part of the edit was from one of Johnson's spokespeople rehearsing how they would deal with Partygate questions.
It wasn't a party, it was cheese and wine. Just be clear, it's not. Is cheese and wine all right? No. It was a business meeting. I'm joking. It is recorded. His fictional party was a business meeting.
Yeah, hilarious. Both former Prime Minister Johnson as well as... Fucking hell, this video is late. As well as former Prime Minister Sunak attended these parties. At first, Johnson said...
Peppa Pig World is very much my kind of place.
Wrong clip, sorry, my bad.
There was no party.
Then he said it was a gathering, but it was for a work event.
What I can tell you is that all the guidelines were observed, continue to be observed.
Once he'd been rumbled, he said he had no knowledge that any of this had even been happening. Right. It is illegal to lie to Parliament like this. In fact, lying to Parliament is more or less what brought down Tony Blair. So you would expect Johnson to do the honourable thing and resign. Well, no, you wouldn't expect that because it's Boris Johnson. This is the Queen, who presumably Conservative voters care quite a lot about in this country, sitting alone at her husband's funeral. And bear in mind, ordinary people didn't get funerals at all. Well, guess what? The night before the funeral, Downing Street held 2 parties at a time when COVID restrictions banned indoor mixing. This is the kind of thing Johnson was trying to pass off as a work meeting. In the end, 83 people, including Johnson and Sunak, were fined for attending about 20 parties. 20. Although Partygate is technically not the scandal that killed them, it basically was. Hearing the news that the government that told you to stay at home while your relatives and friends were dying, and finding out that same government was partying, it did not go over well. Johnson would just about survive this scandal, only to fall into yet another one just a few weeks later when his Deputy Chief Whip resigned following allegations of sexual misconduct, which Johnson knew about before appointing him. And of course, he lied about knowing this, because of course he did. 14 years ago, back when Labour were in charge, 4 ministers resigning was considered a mass resignation, right? On the 5th of July, Chancellor Rishi Sunak and Health Minister Sajid Javid resigned from the cabinet. By the end of the day, 40 people had resigned from Johnson's government, and he'd also fired Michael Gove after he told him his time was up. In the end, there would be over 50 resignations over 3 days, including 20 ministers. In 3 days! He still tried to hang on, but eventually someone strapped him down A Clockwork Orange style so the fucker could see the writing on the wall. Johnson announced his resignation on the 9th of June, becoming the 3rd Prime Minister in a row to resign in disgrace. In his resignation speech, he did not take responsibility for what he had done, neither did he apologise to the public.
But them's the breaks.
Thank fuck that's over. So with Johnson finally gone, maybe things would start to get better. I mean, they couldn't get any fucking worse, surely. Surely. You're fucking kidding me, right?
In December, I'll be in Beijing, opening up new pork markets.
Instead of helping us deal with the new cost of living crisis, the Tories instead held another leadership contest, their third now in 6 years. The main candidates were former Chancellor Rishi Sunak,
I'm a coke addict, total coke addict,
and former Foreign Secretary, among other things, Liz Truss.
We import 2/3 of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
Sunak warned the Tory membership that if they voted for Truss, her questionable economic plans, or lack thereof, would seriously damage the UK economy, and he might have had a bit of a point. Unfortunately for Sunak, he was trying to appeal to the party members who just a few years prior thought voting in Boris Johnson was a good idea. Tory party members are not rational people. I remember at the time thinking how pointless it was to have a leadership contest during a cost of living crisis, but with hindsight, it was even more of a waste of time. Truss won, by the way, becoming Prime Minister on the 6th of September 2022. Just in time for the Queen to give up on this party, and this country, and this planet, and crawl off down to hell where she belongs. Because Queen Liz had died, it meant not Queen Liz, and indeed the whole country, was on a standstill for an official mourning period. About just over a week later though, Truss could get started with her plans. Truss and her Chancellor, Quasi something or other, announced a mini budget full of tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, funded entirely by borrowing. This wasn't just Thatcherism, this was Thatcherism on steroids while huffing glue and necking 24 Red Bulls. This was conservatism unbound from security. This was conservatism on full force. This was going to stimulate growth, because trickle-down economics definitely works, and so yeah, she managed to cost us about 300 billion quid in the space of about 2 weeks. She fired her Chancellor, whatever his name was, and then just a few days later...
Gather around, grab your cheesy nachos and your fucking vuvuzelas. This is what we've all been waiting for. It's the Queen's fucking speech.
Given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected.
Come on, this is fucking history in the making, right? This is the ending of a chapter of a very thin book that nobody enjoyed reading.
That I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
She was in power for 49 days, making her Britain's shortest serving Prime Minister. Her Wikipedia article on her premiership doesn't even get to 1,500 words. The article on spaghetti bolognese is longer than that. Spaghetti bolognese! I do not like Rishi Sunak. I did not like it when he tried to effectively ban protests. I did not like it when he bragged about taking funding away from deprived areas and moving it into affluent Tory neighbourhoods. And I really did not like it when he said trans women weren't women while the mother of a murdered teenage trans girl attended Parliament.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber.
Sunak was seen by pretty much everybody as being severely out of touch with ordinary Britons, which is to be expected when you're literally the wealthiest Prime Minister in history. He was also seen as being generally, just honestly not very good at politics. I mean, he lost the leadership contest to Liz Truss. Fucking hell! Sunak has shifted further and further to the right during his premiership in a bid to try and recapture those core Tory voters. In reality land, what this has actually done is push moderate voters further towards the Labour Party, while the sort of voters he's trying to appeal to are caught up with someone else. This more or less brings us up to the current election, or the last election now, I suppose. But before we get into all that, let's just take stock of what 14 years of conservatism has actually done to this country. We've had 5 Prime Ministers, 4 of which resigned in disgrace, an austerity economy, a Brexit vote built on lies, and a negotiation drowned in chaos. And I didn't even mention how much we pissed off the EU. A mishandled COVID response, a crashed economy, and the fact that I now have to know who Jacob Rees-Mogg is. Everything is broken. Extortionately priced broken public transport, schools and hospitals falling apart, thousands of residential buildings made out of unsafe materials, overcrowded prisons, underfunded police services, record NHS waiting times, the British pound falling to its lowest value in decades, the literal shit in our rivers. After Thatcher's rise to power, the UK effectively stopped building council houses, thus depriving people of, places to live. The last time the UK built a reservoir was in 1992. The last time the UK built a nuclear power station was in 1995. In 1970, the UK's manufacturing industry made up 20.6% of the country's GDP. In 2023, it was 9%. France, Germany and Spain each have around 3,000 kilometres of high-speed rail track. The UK has about a third of that. It gets you from London to France, and that's basically it. The Conservatives did commission a second high-speed rail project called HS2, which was once planned to go as far as London to Edinburgh, then London to Manchester and Liverpool, then just Manchester, then not even Manchester. How about Birmingham? So how much did it cost to get from London to not Edinburgh? £14 billion over budget. Everything is broken. We don't really get anything done anymore. And pretty much everyone who lives outside of Westminster feels like they aren't being listened to. And just generally, the whole place feels a bit fucked. If you look at what austerity has done, it's clearly brought all of our public services down to their fucking knees. As of making this video, there is currently the 11th junior doctor strike on at the moment. This is in a dispute regarding pay, and indeed, the Conservatives have presided over the longest NHS strike in history. Okay, let's get on to the fucking election. Oh, and by the way, I'm not glossing over Sunak because he didn't have any scandals or because he was really good. You can see how long this video is, right? I'm fucking sick to death of talking about these cunts at this point. Maybe I'll go after him more once the dust has settled, we'll see. Anyway. Okay, so unsurprisingly, Sunak could not turn the Tories' electoral chances around. Particularly not helped when he went to Northern Ireland outside the Titanic Museum and was asked whether or not he was captaining a sinking ship.
I mean, look at me. I'm dressed like this, I went to public school, and I'm still not voting Tory. So does that say something?
Even worse though, during the 80th anniversary of D-Day, he decided to leave the events early to come home to the UK to film an interview for ITV, which he literally could have scheduled any other time. He was the one who scheduled it to be on that day.
So like lots of people, there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? But famously, Sky TV.
You'd think that Conservative voters care quite a lot about D-Day, that's something they give a shit about. So fobbing the event off, it's like he just wasn't very good at politics, Anyway, Nigel Farage comes back into reform, and as soon as he does that, then the Conservative vote just gets annihilated. Labour won in a landslide with less votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2019. That massive fucking electoral Labour wipeout. Starmer did worse, but because of the joys of first past the post, he's got a big fuck off majority now. The SNP were decimated in Scotland, which a long time coming. Lib Dems did pretty well. Plaid Cymru did pretty well, that's the Welsh Independence Party. Greens did pretty well. Reform also did do pretty damn well. It was a good election for small parties, and it was a bad election for the Tories.
To Balfour in 06 in terms of vote share, you can go all the way back to the Great Reform Act. You won't find anything like this. Here are the big beasts who've gone: a former Prime Minister, a Defence Secretary, an Education Secretary.
The Conservatives have lost, and have lost primarily because of the votes they have lost to Reform, which has cost the party seat after seat after seat. Around 2/3 of the seats that the Conservatives have lost
me personally, thank God I'm free. It's over and I'm glad.
The Labour Party has won this general election, and I have called Sir Keir Starmer to congratulate him on his victory.
Will this country get any better? Sure fucking hope so. But in the meantime, I'm still gonna try and move to Europe, to be honest. I'll be back relatively soon. It won't take me another 2 months to make a video. And the next one isn't gonna be the length of a fucking feature film. Okay. Fuck off.